I never thought a fishing dock could start a war, but that's exactly what happened. One Thursday morning, I walked down to the lake with a thermos of coffee in one hand and an old tackle box in the other, and where my dock had stood for almost 40 years, there was nothing but water. Not storm damage, not decay, not some accident. It was gone, ripped clean out of the shoreline like it had never existed. The first thing I noticed was the silence. See, when you've lived beside a lake long enough, you get used to things staying where they belong. Trees stay rooted. Rocks stay put. Docks stay attached to the shore. That morning felt wrong before my brain even caught up with what my eyes were seeing. Pieces of treated lumber floated near the reeds. One broken post bobbed in the water about 20 feet from shore. Fresh machine tracks cut through the mud. Somebody hadn't just removed my dock, they'd erased it. I stood there staring for what felt like an hour before I finally looked across the cove. That's when I saw the new resort catching the morning sunlight. All glass walls and expensive balconies, sitting where an old pine grove used to be. The place was called Silver Ridge Shores. Fancy name. Fancy prices. Fancy people who came up from the city on weekends pretending they loved nature while complaining about bugs. The resort had opened 6 months earlier, and from day one there'd been tension. Nothing direct at first. Little comments. Little looks. The kind of stuff that tells you somebody thinks they own more than they actually do. My name's Cole Bennett. I was 58 at the time, born in that county, raised on that lake. My grandfather bought the property in 1952 after coming home from Korea. Back then there weren't vacation homes, resorts, or investors looking for lakefront opportunities. Just fishermen, farmers, and people trying to make a living. The dock had started as a weekend project between my grandfather and his brother. A handful of cedar posts, some rough boards, and enough stubbornness to get the thing standing. My father rebuilt sections of it every few years. Then eventually it became my responsibility. I'd replaced boards, reinforced supports, patched storm damage, and spent more evenings sitting at the end of that dock than I could count. My wife, Karen, used to sit there with me before cancer took her. My son learned how to cast from that dock. Hell, I'd probably cried on that dock more than once after everyone went home and nobody was watching. So when some stranger looked at it and saw an obstacle to a better view, they weren't seeing wood. They were looking at pieces of my life. Around noon, I drove over to the resort office. The lobby smelled like lemon polish and money. Behind the front desk sat a young woman who looked nervous the second I introduced myself. She made a phone call, and 5 minutes later a man in a gray suit came walking out. Perfect haircut, perfect smile, perfect kind of guy who'd never repaired anything with his own hands. "Mr. Bennett," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Trevor Lang, Operations Director. How can I help you?" I ignored the hand. Somebody tore out my dock. His smile didn't disappear. It just changed shape. The waterfront structure. Waterfront structure. That's what he called it. Like it was a traffic cone. "Yeah," I said. "My dock." He folded his hands together. "According to our consultants, that installation presented visual inconsistencies with the shoreline development plan." I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was so ridiculous my brain didn't know what else to do. Visual inconsistencies? The structure lacked updated permitting documentation. It was built before your consultants were born. Unfortunately, compliance standards evolve. That's when I realized something. Trevor wasn't apologizing because he didn't think they'd done anything wrong. Somewhere along the line, these people convinced themselves that money outranked history, that buying land nearby somehow gave them authority over everybody else. I leaned closer across his desk. "You destroyed private property." His smile finally cracked a little. "Our legal department disagrees." I nodded slowly. Good. Good. Yeah. Because now we're having the same conversation. I left before my temper got the better of me. The drive home took 15 minutes. The anger stayed a lot longer. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on my porch watching moonlight bounce across the water, trying to figure out what bothered me most. The dock itself was replaceable. Lumber could be bought. Posts could be driven into the lakebed again. What bothered me was the arrogance. The assumption that because they had investors and lawyers and architects, they got to decide what mattered. Around midnight, I grabbed a flashlight and started walking. There's an old dirt road that snakes through the hills behind the lake. Most people use the paved entrance now, but locals know the original route. As I followed it through the trees, something tugged at the back of my memory. My father used to talk about that road. Not often, just random stories while fixing engines or cleaning fish. I remembered him mentioning property lines one time. Easements. Survey markers. Things I didn't care about when I was 20. But standing there in the darkness, hearing gravel crunch beneath my boots, I suddenly wondered if maybe I should have listened more carefully. The next morning, I climbed into my truck and headed toward the county records office, not because I had a plan yet, but because something in my gut kept telling me there was a piece of this story nobody at Silver Ridge Shores knew existed. And by the time I pulled into the parking lot, I was determined to find it. When I walked into the county records office that morning, I didn't have some grand plan. I didn't even have the right words for what I was looking for. I just knew there was a gap in the story that didn't make sense. The clerk behind the counter, an older woman with reading glasses hanging on a chain, asked for my parcel number, and I handed her what little paperwork I had on my property. She disappeared into the back for a while, and I just stood there listening to the hum of fluorescent lights, thinking about my dock floating in pieces somewhere out there in the lake. When she came back, she had a thin folder in her hands. Nothing impressive at first glance, just worn paper and stamped pages. But the moment I opened it, I felt something shift. There it was, a construction access agreement from years ago, signed between the previous landowner and a development company that no longer existed under the same name. It was simple on the surface, almost harmless sounding. Temporary access for construction vehicles to reach the lakeside development zone during building phase, with clear language that said the easement would expire upon completion of construction unless renewed in writing. I read it twice, then a third time slower, because sometimes your brain needs time to accept what your eyes are already telling you. That road behind the resort, the one I had just walked the night before, the one everyone assumed belonged to Silver Ridge Shores, didn't actually belong to them in the way they thought it did. It crossed my land for the steepest final stretch before reaching the lakefront. And according to this document, that right-of-way wasn't permanent. It was conditional, temporary, and it had never been renewed. I remember laughing under my breath right there in that quiet office, not because it was funny, but because it was almost unreal how something so small on paper could explain so much arrogance in real life. I asked the clerk if this was enforceable, and she just shrugged like people do when they've seen too many land disputes to be surprised anymore, and said, "If it's recorded like that, it's enforceable unless challenged in court." That was all I needed. I didn't go home right away. I sat in my truck in the parking lot for a long time staring at the folder on the passenger seat, thinking about Trevor Lang's polished smile, about visual inconsistencies, about how casually they tore out something that had been in my family longer than most of their investors had been alive. It wasn't anger anymore at that point. It was clarity. The next morning, I filed a termination notice with the county, referencing the exact clause in the agreement. No drama, no speeches, just paperwork moving through the system like it was designed to do. The clerk stamped it, scanned it, and told me it would be processed immediately since the conditions were already met. I asked her if people usually notice when this happens, and she gave me a look like she was deciding whether to be honest or polite, then said, "They usually notice when access stops." I didn't tell anyone at the resort. I didn't warn them. I didn't call Trevor Lang or send an email or try to negotiate. That's the thing about legal rights. You don't need permission to use them, and you don't need applause either. 3 days later, I started hearing it. First came confusion, then frustration, then full-blown chaos. I was out by the lake when I saw the first delivery truck sitting at the bend in the road, its engine idling while a driver argued with a security guard at the gate. From where I stood, I could hear raised voices carried by the wind, something about alternate route and system override. But there was no alternate route that didn't add 40 minutes through back forest roads. By the end of that afternoon, a chain had gone up across the access road right where it crossed my property line, a simple metal barrier with a wooden sign that read "Private Property No Access." I didn't even have to be there when it happened. I just saw the result. And then the resort started to feel it in real time. The first luxury sedan tried to turn around and scraped its underside on the gravel shoulder, the sound echoing up the hillside like a warning nobody wanted to hear. Tour buses stopped coming entirely after 2 drivers refused to risk the incline. And suddenly the exclusive lakeside experience required guests to park half a mile away and walk in through uneven ground with their luggage. I watched a group of wedding guests in expensive clothes stumbling along the dirt path, one woman holding her heels in her hand, laughing in that strained way people do when they're trying not to admit something is going wrong. Inside the resort, things started breaking down faster than they could manage. Food deliveries arrived late, sometimes not at all. Laundry trucks turned around halfway up the hill after getting stuck in soft mud from recent rain. Construction crews for new villas began missing deadlines because materials were sitting on the highway waiting for access that no longer existed. And every single complaint, every delay, every frustrated call from investors, all traced back to the same thing: that road they had always assumed was theirs to control. I didn't have to interfere. I didn't block anything beyond what was legally mine. I didn't sabotage. I didn't threaten. I didn't even raise my voice. I just stood on my land and watched the consequences unfold like a system finally running without its hidden assumptions. A week into it, I got a phone call from an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. Then another call. Then a third. Finally, a message from Trevor Lang himself, his voice not as smooth as before, saying they needed to discuss an urgent access misunderstanding. I almost laughed again hearing that word, misunderstanding. That evening I was back at the lake when a black SUV pulled up near the edge of my property line. He got out alone this time. No suit jacket, no confidence, just a man trying to look like he still had control of something that was slipping away. "We need to talk," he said when he saw me. I didn't move from the dockless shoreline. "Funny," I said. "I was thinking the same thing when you tore mine out." He exhaled like he was trying to stay professional. "That structure was non-compliant." I nodded slowly. "And this road is temporary." That hit him differently. I could see it. For the first time, he looked past the talking points and actually understood the structure he was standing on wasn't what he thought it was. "You're blocking access to a multi-million-dollar development," he said. I looked out over the lake instead of at him. "No," I said quietly. "Your development was using access that expired years ago." I just finally closed the door. He tried to respond, but nothing came out clean. That's when I realized something important. People like him don't usually deal with consequences that don't come with a negotiation table attached. He wasn't used to losing access to leverage. The resort started scrambling after that. Emergency meetings, legal consultations, survey teams being sent out to verify boundaries. But boundaries don't change just because you suddenly need them to. Within days, online reviews started shifting. Not because of the dock anymore. Nobody even knew about that part. But because guests were tired, frustrated, and confused about why getting to a luxury resort felt like crossing a construction zone that never ended. And somewhere in all of that noise, I just kept fishing where my dock used to be, sitting on a folding chair now instead of wood planks, watching the water move like it always had, like none of it really cared what humans decided to argue about. 2 weeks after the chain went up, I saw something I didn't expect. The resort's marketing banners started coming down along the main highway, quietly, like someone was trying to erase the idea of perfection before it got questioned too much. And that's when I knew they were finally understanding the scale of what had happened, not as punishment, but as structure. Not revenge, just reality catching up. And that's when the real meeting finally got scheduled. The meeting wasn't held in some boardroom like I expected. It happened down by the lake, right where the broken shoreline still showed faint scars from where my dock used to be. I remember walking down there and seeing them already waiting, Trevor Lang in a wrinkled shirt that used to look expensive, and beside him the resort director, a woman I hadn't seen before, sharp eyes, but no patience left behind them. No assistants, no polished entourage, just the two of them standing there like the version of their world that used to feel untouchable had finally started to shrink. I didn't sit right away, I just looked out at the water for a moment. The same water that had seen my grandfather build that dock, my father repair it, and me lose it in a single morning of corporate convenience. Trevor cleared his throat first. "We'd like to resolve this," he said carefully, like each word had to pass through legal approval before leaving his mouth. I nodded once. "You already started resolving it when you tore down my dock." Silence. The director stepped forward slightly. "We understand there was a miscommunication regarding access rights," she said, choosing the phrase like it was the safest tool in the room. I almost smiled. "No," I said quietly. "There wasn't a miscommunication. There was an assumption. Big difference." The wind moved across the lake, and for a second nobody spoke. Then Trevor tried again. "We can restore the dock. Better materials, reinforced foundation, lighting, even compensate for damages." I finally turned to look at him. "You think this was about wood and nails?" He didn't answer, and that told me enough. I continued, not raising my voice, just letting it sit steady between us. That dock wasn't an amenity. It wasn't decoration. It was my history, my family's history. And you didn't ask. You didn't even hesitate. The director looked down toward the shoreline, like she was seeing it differently for the first time. We followed environmental consultants, she said, but even she didn't sound convinced anymore. I nodded slowly, and I followed paperwork. That line landed heavier than anything else, because that's what changed the energy between us, not emotion, not anger, but structure. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a folded document. The termination notice. The recorded easement revocation. The county stamp still visible in blue ink. I didn't wave it around, I just held it. That road you've been using, I said, it doesn't belong to you anymore. It never really did. You were operating on time that expired before your resort even opened. Trevor shook his head slightly, like he was trying to reject the reality without having to argue it directly. That road is essential to our operations, he said. So is my dock, I replied. That was the first time his expression really changed. Not anger, not confidence. Something closer to realization, the uncomfortable kind that doesn't come with a solution attached. For the first time, I think he understood this wasn't a negotiation where money automatically fixed the problem. The director exhaled slowly. What do you want? She asked, direct now, no more soft language. I took a moment before answering. Not because I didn't know, but because I wanted them to understand the weight of it. I want my waterfront restored exactly as it was, I said. Same footprint. Same access to the lake. No reinterpretations. No redesigns for your marketing photos. I paused, then added, and I want a formal recognition of my property rights, recorded. Not discussed. Recorded. Trevor looked like he wanted to interrupt, but didn't. I continued. And the road. If you want to keep using it, you pay for it. Not once. Not as a favor. As an agreement. Every year. On paper. That last part changed everything. Because now it wasn't about emotion or pride or who was right in some abstract sense. It was about ongoing cost. About structure. About dependency. The director looked at Trevor, then back at me. We can agree to terms, she said slowly. Trevor hesitated, just for a second too long, then nodded. We'll need legal drafting, he said. I shrugged. That's what lawyers are for. And just like that, the tone shifted. Not victory, not defeat, something quieter. Like two systems finally acknowledging they were tied to each other whether they liked it or not. Over the next few weeks, things moved fast. Surveyors came and went. Legal teams drafted and redrafted agreements. The resort's contractors returned to rebuild the dock exactly where it had been, though I noticed they didn't try to improve it anymore. They just followed instructions this time. No creativity, no upgrades, just compliance. The road reopened under formal terms, not ownership, not assumption, but documented access with payment attached. And slowly, the chaos settled. Guests returned, though the reviews never fully went back to what they used to be. Something had changed in the story of that place, and people could feel it even if they didn't know why. One evening, months later, I found myself sitting again at the edge of the new dock. Same lake, same wind, different wood under my boots. I thought about how easy it would have been for all of this to go another direction if they had just asked instead of assumed, or if I had just let it go instead of paying attention to the paperwork my father once mentioned in passing like it wasn't important. Funny thing about ownership, most people think it's loud, like power or money or control. But sometimes it's just quiet documentation sitting in a county office waiting for someone to care enough to read it. I dipped my hand into the water and watched the ripples spread out, slow and steady, like nothing in the world had ever been interrupted. And I still wonder, sometimes, if any of it was necessary, or if it all just happened because nobody wanted to be the first to respect what was already there. If you were in my place, would you have done the same, or walked away?